Welcome. This is the Global Summit House podcast. Catch power interviews and discussions with influential, inspiring, and powerful people. Explore what's possible by tuning into this podcast with our all-new The Writers Project episodes, featuring one of the world's most inspired thinkers and writers. Visit our website at www.globalsummithouse.com.
I'm really pleased to be here with a gentleman who is on a similar path to what I find myself on, which is really trying to understand kind of the deeper nature of who we are and where we come from and where we're headed. Welcome, Juan Valdez, author of The Seeker, Chasing Ghosts. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to talk to you. Nice to meet you, Chris.
Thank you, Juan. So, Juan, you are a systems engineer, a computer guy, and at the same time, you're doing a ton of work in the spiritual realm of things. Talk a little bit about kind of how you bridged that gap and what got you started in this.
Yeah, so it's a good question. We touched on this just a bit ago, but it's kind of, I looked at them, I think, over the years as separate disciplines, and they were pursued separately. One we'll call kind of under kind of a mystical track, and the other kind of under a professional / systems engineer or software engineer track. And I think what's occurred to me really just recently, I'm working on another book now. As I've gotten deeper into the sacred geometry and some of the underlying metaphysics and ontology of existence, much of which is spelled out in many of the ancient texts that I've read and studied for many years, the ability to kind of parse through that, discern that, and look at it from a kind of a systems engineering perspective has been clearly very valuable, because you're really looking at effectively, whether you believe in intelligent design or not, right? You're looking at very sophisticated systems design, right? That's and understanding how all that kind of comes into play as it manifests in energy and other areas of your life, psychology. It's become very relevant, certainly to the work that I'm doing right now. I think in the other part that's worth mentioning, which we touched on too, is as it relates to cognitive science and computer science and how those kind of fields have kind of, become coupled in the last decade or two, relative to the fact specifically that computer science and computers are a way to empirically validate and test certain theories of mind and psychology as it relates to, machine learning, artificial intelligence. They're now trying to, put together and build. There's a ton of money going into, quantum computing. And, the idea of, the mind and the empirical reality as it stands relative to computer science are starting to form kind of a single thread. So as it turns out, what I thought were kind of two separate disciplines, at least in some of the work that I'm doing now, are starting to merge in a way that was unexpected. So.
In mysticism and that sort of thing, did you start doing work in that area separately, or did what you had learned in computer science, systems engineering, that sort of thing, did that drive this kind of desire to understand mysticism and spirituality, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so the mysticism was a as an engineer, effectively, I'm the kid that was playing around with blocks all the time, right?
Yep.
That learned how to write and talk and all that other stuff. But I'm the kid that was in the back that was playing with blocks, right? So, as an engineer, we're effectively building things, testing things, and so on. And that sort of practical mindset in terms of, is it effective, right, is always something in the back of an engineer's mind. They tend to be very practical.
Mm-hmm.
The mysticism aspect came in my early 20s when I was trying to become a professional tennis player. I played all throughout my youth, And it became clear that in certain positions and places in during matches, particularly as you get into very high competitive play, where a lot of matches come down to just a couple of key points here and there, something's happening that's not physical in those situations. And if you're an athlete playing at very high levels, it's just clear as day. What you're trying to do when you reach those levels is remove kind of the analytic mind from the process, such that you can kind of let your greatest athlete manifest. I mean, that's effectively the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, as it turns out, there are specific methods that you can use in order to do that. And I think there was, I forget the guy's name, but there was a famous psychologist in the 80s and 90s that worked with Agassi and a bunch of the top players. Jim Lohr, I think Lohr was the guy's name. And he developed very ritualistic techniques in order to do that. So you would sort of lose yourself in the ritual of, competition. And as such, that sort of part of the mind that held you back would fall away. So it turns out I spent, a lot of years studying yoga and meditation to try and figure out how to solve for that problem. That's
Right.
basically what I was trying to do. Right. And that sort of bled very naturally into meditation, which involves kind of a ritual and incantation and mantras. And that's the whole thing kind of blended together for me. And then the philosophy and the mysticism became more relevant than the tennis, even though, it nonetheless helped me compete and play better over the years. No question about that. So
and wouldn't you say that from the standpoint of developing these techniques, that all of a sudden tennis also became a way of expressing that deeper underlying spiritual aspect of what was going on?
yeah, I mean, that's, it's a very astute point, right? I mean, you come to a place at the sort of the end, with something I'm starting to write about more so today than I have historically, as I pull some of these threads together that I've been working on for decades now, which is scary to even say that it's been that long that I've been working on some of these problems. But you start to pull things together in a way, and they start to make sense. And and they talk about this in the Vedas with the the name escapes me, the Agnes sacrifice. I'm butchering the name. My teacher would kill me. But it's the fire sacrifice basically, which is sort of the incantation and the way to full knowledge. Effectively, it's spelled out in the Katha Upanishad. I write about it quite a bit. And ultimately you end up with a place where your life is a sacrifice, right? And your life is sort of a devotion and sort of a sacrifice up to the supreme ultimate, right? And that's a very high place to be, but there are sub-compartments of that, as you mentioned, right? So that the match itself, the tennis match, can be sort of a sacrificial exercise of devotion and of an expression of the divine. When you go to work, if you're at a very high place, depending upon what you're doing, these are the things that Swami Vivekananda talks a lot about in terms of the 4 yogas and how to reach kind of, this sort of state of enlightenment and being, whether it be through work, whether it be through devotion, whether it be through knowledge or through spiritual practices, which is, the yoga. They all become this means of expression of the divine. But of course, we all get lost along the way in all the details and stuff. But that's certainly called out specifically as, once we've reached a place where you can kind of recognize that and live that, you've come to a pretty high place.
So just before we get into the book, talk a little bit about what your impression of getting to that place of living it and living a more, I guess, is it in tune with the spiritual side in the physical plane? Is that how you would?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. So firstly, and this is important to spell out and be clear about, I don't necessarily consider myself enlightened by any stretch of the imagination, right? I'm a very flawed human being like everybody else that's running around, right? I've got a family, I've got 2 kids, I've got an ex-wife. You speak to my ex-wife, she's going to give you a whole different picture. You know what I'm saying? So like, I'm right there with everybody. Okay. So now, having said that, and I think this is really true for everyone, we all have our moments, right? There's this ebb and flow of life and energy that allows you to kind of move in between, enlightened states and unenlightened states in this sort of ebb and flow, this sort of idea of cycles, right?
Yep.
And for me, the practice and the process has been one of gradual over time of, alignment of the inside and the outside, the inner world, the inner voice, and the outer world. And, there might be a lag there, and the
Sure.
lag may be a decade, it may be 20 years, it may be a year, 6, whatever it is. But, you got to stay grounded, and you got to find a way to kind of work through the situations that are presented to you in life, such that, you can not just reconcile, but align, that inner world with the outer world, such that enlightenment can kind of unfold. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. I think some people would say, well, come on, what are you talking about? And at some level, for me, I think that what I hear you saying is, at some level, we learn to kind of peel away the stuff that the adversity, and find kind of what the gift is under that.
Yeah. And be able to starkly reflect on the nature of your being, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your being is your personality and your form, right? Just as much as it's your inside voice and your spirit, right?
Right.
So the two are conjoined. And I think a lot of the mystical traditions, at least the way that they're taught today, miss this integral component. And this is part of the reasons, the impetus for the fourth book. But it's like, yes, it might be an illusion. And yes, there might be something more real, but that's not an excuse for you not to deal with your shit, pardon the expression. Do you know what I mean? Like,
and so much of, I think, what you're talking about is also this idea that for us to be spiritual, that what we need to do is to discard at some level, discard our existence here. And it's
yeah. And that's false. That idea is false. So,
Thank you.
Even the great say Ramakrishna, which is the school within which I was taught at the Ramakrishna Center in New York. I'll call them out. They're a great lineage of academics and published monks that have come from India that have helped spread Vedanta in certainly in the New York area. I was trained there by Swami Adeswarananda, and Ramakrishna is effectively the sage, the saint that they honor and they look up to, and even at his level of sainthood and his level of bliss consciousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's still dealing with his brother and his cousin, and he's dealing with the guy that owns the temple that he worships at, and he's dealing with all of those issues. Now, he might not be dealing with them so effectively because his head's in the clouds, but he is placed within a time and place and a situation, and all of those nuances about his life that seemed, that may seem insignificant at the time, all of them sort of come to form the legend of who he is, and who we understand him to be is an expression of how he manifests and how he navigates through all those issues. He was a married man. He took disciples. And so, they call it in the Indian tradition, kind of the Leela, the play of the Lord, it's like, and, it's big in the, in the Krishna, people that worship Krishna as well, it's, and also the Mahabharata, right? The idea that, okay, divine bliss and consciousness may be the only thing that ultimately there is, but, we still live in a world that needs to be respected and understood and is also divine, right?
Boy, we miss that, don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the thing that fascinates me is that we have a tendency to completely miss that. And if everything is divine bliss in the final kind of reality, boy, oh boy, the value of experiences that are tough and that are, that require learning, there's such huge value if that's the way we look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's an expression of the divine, right? I mean, it can annoy you. it can look, you can be imprisoned for certain situations. You can have all sorts of confrontations that are present. There are fights there, however the situation presents itself, it's all divine. Now that doesn't make it any easier to stomach sometimes. I mean, it's still difficult, but it doesn't change the fundamental assertion that it's a manifestation of the divine, and in some very real sense, and this is some of the stuff that I'm getting into in the latest book, which is it's just fascinating from a systems and an architecture and metaphysical standpoint. In some sense, that external world is a reflection of the inner world, and it's not kind of in the ethereal psychological sense. It's in a very real, physically manifested sense that what you're seeing and experiencing, is coming from, or stems from, and is very much correlated and related to your inner being,
Mhm.
and so that's kind of the practical aspect of the mysticism, right? Which is, if you can understand how things actually work, okay, and you can then focus on alignment with that functioning system, right? Or basically, from an engineering standpoint, you're doing it, it's a systems optimization problem, right?
Mhm.
If you optimize the system, you're going to have the easiest path through, right? Because you're optimizing the system. But if you have a fundamental misunderstanding of how things work, I mean, good luck, man, because it's tough.
And aren't you really saying that you're optimizing yourself, your thinking with the system, and aligning with that at some level?
Well, yes, but I'm taking it one step further. I'm saying that you are the system,
Got it.
right?
Yep.
And the outside and the inner are part of the same continuum,
Right.
right? So, it's like it's mind-blowing because in its subtlety and in its simplicity, but it's completely inverting in terms of the, in terms of its implications in people's daily lives. And I remember when I was a freshman in college, one of the books I read that was, and I had the most profound experience with, and I've always been fascinated by books, right? And I guess writers are, but Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig, I
Yep.
read when I was 18. And I mean, he gets right to the heart of this issue as it relates specifically to two people taking a motorcycle ride across the country, one of whom cares about his bike because he cares about quality and he wants to make sure things are okay and things are tuned right. Even if something's a little off, it kind of bothers him. And somebody else that doesn't care if it's broke, they just send it to the mechanic and they don't care.
Right.
And, he sort of, with his razor's edge, even back then, right? I think that book was published in the 80s or the 90s. It's like, what is wrong with people? They're like running through life with this sort of objective, realist, materialistic mindset that, everything is there to kind of serve their own gratification. And they just, they're just playing somebody else's game.
Well, and there's nothing deeper to that experience, is there?
Yeah, no, but it's almost worse than that, right? Because they're living with improper understanding.
Mm-hmm.
So it's inefficient, right? I'm looking at it from the pure engineering standpoint. It's an inefficient solve for the problem because it's not fully optimized for the real underlying metaphysics.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying? And
Yep.
it's a solve. You can live in a materialistic way, right? Everything, objects are real, the table, everything's real.
Yep.
People are, either, part of my life or not, doesn't matter. We're not all connected. I just have my own little box. You
Yep.
can live like that, but it's a very limited vision and has, it's limited on all sides, right? It's limited in terms of, not only expression of the divine, but, manifestation of the divine, which in turn, yields happiness, contentment, all those other things that I think generally people like.
Joy, the feeling
Joy,
of greater
Yeah.
than myself, which is so much more powerful than here I am.
Yes, exactly. It is empowering.
How
No
can you
question.
serve me?
Yeah, right.
So let's talk a little bit about the book that we are looking at today, The Seeker, Chasing Ghosts, and then as a side note, Theology Reconsidered is something that you've published at the same time. Is that right?
Yeah, so let me spend a minute on just how the two are related. So Theology Reconsidered, it's almost like a survey of, knowledge in antiquity and its evolution to present day in a nutshell. And it looks primarily and focuses primarily on ancient texts and sort of the initial source material. It covers Eurasia from, Northern Africa, Egypt, Greece, a little bit of Persia and ancient Iran, India, the Vedic tradition, which I was taught in, specifically the Buddhism, and then ancient Chinese as well. I didn't cover the Native American stuff because that's a whole nother ball of wax, but and looking for the patterns of perspectives, let's say, in that sort of intellectual landscape, and as that intellectual landscape progresses through time. It was a beast of a work. It ended up, I think 900 pages plus, and it became readily apparent to me as I was writing it, or certainly as I was getting close to the end, that in terms of approachability, it was lacking. So at some point I was kind of looking for some sort of a crystallized way that I could communicate some of the same messages. And I came up with The Seeker. So in that respect, it's kind of a compendium work. Its original working title was Songs of the Soul. And it's kind of lined up for, the analytic approach that's reflected in Theology Reconsidered, which is more of sort of a reference manual and kind of how I got from point A to point B. And then The Seeker is kind of a compendium manual that looks at, the soul's journey through life and, its import and relevance to, to being and to living, right? So they're coupled a little bit like that.
And my understanding is that in The Seeker, it's all poetry. Isn't that right?
Yeah, there's a little, it's divided into, looking at the 4 sections, and each section is a set of poetry. So I wrote about, there's about 80 or 90 poems that are published here. And each section has kind of a 2 or 3 page intro that talks a little bit about the underlying philosophy and mysticism of a given section. So, love and loss, change and rebirth is the first one, which is obviously a very deep, theme, reaching very far back into antiquity, and forms some of the basis of Jungian and Freudian psychology, right? The mystery of life, play of the divine. We talked a little bit about that already. Leela is known in the Vedic tradition, the sort of the divine play, as it were. Meditation in the mind, mystic ponderings, right? So we get a little bit into, Gnana yoga, a little bit of, knowledge and, analysis of the mind through which, greater understandings are revealed and are opened up to us. And then, passing thoughts on humanity and civilization, which we talked a little bit about as it relates to the Pirsig book. There's something missing from, global society right now. That's just, it's not just head scratching. It's like you just want to kind of beat your head against the wall sometimes, because, people kind of take this kind of objective, what's in it for me attitude. And, we've reached a point as a global population where, like, this is the most massive extinction we've had in tens of millions of years. Even if you don't believe in humans being the source of climate change, if you're not waking up when everything else around us is dying, what else needs to happen, right? And that's kind of the era that we live in. And I think conversely, it's not just me, it's not just you that are, kind of feeling and expressing some of these ideas. I think there's been a movement around Eastern philosophy and mysticism over the last, certainly over the last 50 years. And has become much more commonplace. But there's, now you just see, in terms of, climate change and people kind of looking for social reform, you can kind of feel the upswelling of people that have they've kind of had enough with this old way of thinking, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of what we're seeing today in the, in the political sphere and the socioeconomic sphere and the intellectual sphere, which is kind of where I am with some of these books. It's reflecting the same movement, if you will, right?
And there in the spiritual practices, there's a whole lot of talk about major changes in the planet that I think are addressing exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So you wrote this book with these 4 sections and with all these different pieces of poetry. One of the things that really strikes me is a note about how important adversity is to our spiritual growth. I don't think it was phrased quite that way, but I think it's close. Is that a pretty big piece of the puzzle for you in terms of saying, look, things that are adverse or that are tough for us to deal with have inherent value spiritually?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and very astute. And I don't even know that that point is being made consciously in The Seeker, but I think you've picked up on the fact that it's kind of a subconscious theme almost. Um, it's a very mystical idea, and when I use the term mysticism, I'm talking about basically a metaphysics of consciousness, more or less, that's endemic to really all of ancient society's perspective and worldview. And that somehow over the course of the last 1,000 years or so, through scientism, empiricism, and all the others, we've kind of lost a lot of that. And so we're in the process, as a global society, reclaiming some of that, right? But in that ancient mindset, they deal in cycles. And I'm working through a lot of this material right now as it relates to sacred geometry. And astrology, for example, and the planets and the cycle of the planets and the cycle of the year and the the spring and the coming forth of food, right, and plenty, right, to feed that whole mindset of and our interrelationship with the earth and sort of the struggle of rebirth, right, and life and death, and that whole kind of struggle is baked into the whole worldview and mindset in antiquity. And we've kind of looked at, and I think again you kind of hit the nail on the head with that point, because today I think we look at, well, life should be easy, and if it's not easy, it's a problem. And maybe the mindset, an inverted mindset, as you bring up, may be a much better way to look at it, because a problem, when it manifests for you, it becomes an opportunity, right? And you can see this even with personal relations sometimes, right? When you get into an argument with somebody, it could go south and, you could never talk to them again. That's an option, but it's also an opportunity to kind of reset with that person and, help them understand why they're important to you and, why you reacted the way that you did, and potentially get, feedback from them as to, why what it is that you did bothered them. Right. And it becomes an opportunity for growth, not just for you, but, for the other person as well. But I don't know how many people look at things like that.
But don't you think that a big piece of what you're trying to accomplish with this book, I think especially The Seeker, as opposed to Theology Reconsidered, is just this idea of, wait a minute, we can look at things in a different way and find so much more value and meaning, and a deeper connection to people when we kind of switch and as you said earlier, when we kind of align with the system.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. And that definitely is an undercurrent theme there of hey, the mindset is a little bit off, and if we align it, there's a different way of looking at things that will help you, one way or the other. I mean, look, ignorance is bliss up to a certain point, right? But
Yeah.
once you start killing the planet, it's like all bets are off, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you have kids. I've got a bunch, 3 to be exact.
Same here.
Okay, like we have a planet that we need to leave to these kids, and and a political structure and a socioeconomic structure. I got kids that are, entering college now. I got nephews that are coming out looking for what are they going to do?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how should they be looking at kind of aligning their careers with, with where we are as, as a global society, or as a, or even as Americans, I mean, and I don't think, they're not taught any of this stuff in school. And, that comes with problems, right?
Yes, it does. It does. But don't you think that ultimately, if I can teach my kids to be aligned with the systems of the world at a deeper level, that a lot of those questions are going to resolve themselves at some level?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a word that comes to mind that explains it, which roots this discussion in philosophical inquiry, and that's Dharma, which is very big in the Indian tradition as it relates to Vedanta, again, which is the discipline where really I come from, and it's also an integral part of Buddhism. And it's the idea of, it's karma, yes, but it's like, what is your life's purpose, right? And how do you kind of order your life and the things that you do, either professionally or with family life, with the universe as it manifests, right?
Mhm.
There's some things that we can't choose, our family, certain situations, right? It's kind of part of the package,
Yep.
right? But our Dharma is, I've been talking to my daughter a lot over the last couple of weeks about vocation. It's the same sort of idea, right?
Mhm.
Like, well, what am I going to say? Well, what is it that you want to do, right? What's your calling? And, we've lost that idea in the
Right.
West a little bit, but, we kind of need to dust off some of these old manuals, basically, 2,500-year-old manuals, right? That says, well, there's a way of aligning our way of being with the way things are if we have a proper understanding,
Yeah.
right? And that's the bridge that I'm trying to build, is the last piece. Like, okay, let's just at least have an understanding as to how things are structured, and how pretty much all of the ancient texts are telling us this, and have been telling us this for thousands of years, but we now have basically the physics to support it. And so, that being the case, okay, what's the best way to, to realign your perspective on the world, so that, your Dharma can be aligned, and so that, you can have sort of an optimal, happiness or contentment relative to your current situation, right?
Absolutely. So here's my question. We've got to wrap up pretty quickly, but I think the big question that I have is, when you look at all the work you've done, and it's massive. I mean, you're not dabbling here,
Yeah,
Juan.
my dabbling days are far behind me. Yeah, it's true.
When you look at all of the texts that you've examined from these ancient texts, and you look at where we are today, what's kind of the core that you can say to your kids? Look, all of this stuff from 2,500 years ago, more, all of that is pointing to today. What does that look like from
Well, so
your
yeah, so
standpoint?
the fundament, it's a really good question, right? And it gets to the heart of the matter. And this is the issue, right? And this Pirsig hit the nail on the head too. It's that we're all connected, and not just humans, all animals, plant life, all life, sentient
Mhm.
life
Mhm.
is connected in a way that we see can be measured, okay, as it relates to quantum mechanics specifically, okay? There's a
Yep.
level of interconnectivity, universal interconnectivity, that is empirically testable, okay, and has been proven that essentially, moves beyond classical physical boundaries, particularly the speed of light, right?
Mhm.
Things are interconnected in a way, and we know that and have known that for decades. Okay. That level of interconnectivity is not just a physical matter connectivity, because you're dealing with the underlying substratum of physical existence, all
Mhm.
physical existence.
Yep.
If we are all connected, you need to appreciate that, you need to understand that, and then you need to realign your behavior that reflects that. that the success of your neighbor, the success of your colleague is your success. And inversely, their failure is your failure. And it's not just because there's no I in team. You know what I'm saying? That you learn in third grade gym class. There's something much more profound at work here that different disciplines are all starting to kind of tease out and tell us about. But we got to pull all the pieces together and understand that, you know, we don't need to be Bible thumpers necessarily, but there's kernels of truth in those texts that tell us that behaving in a certain way is going to be a problem. And it's not just because we don't want you to get in trouble with the church. It's because when you slap your neighbor, you're doing nothing else than slapping yourself. And your inability to see that and understand that doesn't change the truth of it, right?
Boy, that is right on the money. And if I could help my kids, which I do, I try to do that in a variety of ways to help them have that understanding that, you know, this is something bigger than you, but because it's bigger than you and it's a part of you, it's a much deeper and richer experience you can have.
Yeah. And it opens up all these doors. That's the fun part, right? Yeah. But, you know, the doors aren't all pleasure either, you know, because you still have all that karma and stuff that needs to be worked out. But it does open up doors to understanding and appreciation and levels of awareness and bliss consciousness and all that other stuff, which are pretty cool. But like, you know, the spiritual journey comes with the highs and the lows, just like life does. You know, I don't want anybody to think that, you know, it's easier on the other side. It's just, you know, I, for one, would like to be, you know, have my eyes as open as possible. Yeah. And, you know, as my eyes open, I feel an obligation to kind of document that as long, you know, and leave the breadcrumbs so that people following in my footsteps don't have to do all the same work all over again.
Right. Exactly. Well, yeah. I'll tell you, I am super impressed with what you've done. I'm blown away by the thought of you writing the Theology Reconsidered book at 900 pages, and then figured out that if that's the wide end of the funnel, that somewhere down at the base of the funnel came The Seeker, Chasing Ghosts, a series of poems in 4 different sections. I'm really impressed with what you're doing, Juan, and I think that there is so much and so many different ways to come to this understanding, don't you think?
Yeah, I think a lot of disciplines are kind of all going into the same place. And it's a fascinating time to be alive and, you know, in this sort of academic and intellectual landscape. But at the same time, you know, you have all this unrest. Yeah. Because, you know, a lot of the old ways of thinking are starting to become untenable, right? And that's a scary place for everyone to be. And so it's a fascinating time and an interesting time, you know, but it's, you know, there's a lot of fear out there too, which I respect and understand. And, you know, I'm hopeful that, you know, kind of, you know, now that we've got the inauguration, we have a lot of that transition behind us, that we find a little bit of a new equilibrium here. But, I mean, gosh, things, you know, the last year or two, you know, politically and with COVID and everything, it's been, you know, it's been a unique time to say the least, right?
Yeah. And certainly challenging for people that aren't spending loads of time trying to kind of connect to their spirituality.
Sure.
I'm sure it's a place that can feel very lost. Although at the same time, I also think that, you know, when you look at it from the standpoint of somebody who's spent more time in the pursuit of their own spirituality, that it does begin to make a bit more sense. So Juan Valdez wrote The Seeker, Chasing Ghosts. Thank you so much for doing this. Also, be sure to go to snowconenyc.com. That's snowconenyc.com for the Snow Cone Diaries that you've written. And you're going to find that Juan, you've got a lot of game going on there. So thank you to you. Thank you to Global Summit House for helping in the marketing of this book. And we're really pleased to be a part of it. One last thought, Juan.
Yes.
What's the one last thought you want people to walk away with?
Namaste, peace. Everyone just try and take it easy, be nice to each other, and, make it just a little bit easier for the next guy to get through their day. It won't kill you, I promise.
Oh, it'll make your life a lot better too.
Yeah.
Juan, thanks so much. Sure appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chris. Take care.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Global Summit House podcast. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Podbean, iHeartRadio, iTunes, or Google Play. Connect with us at globalsummithouse.com. See you on the next episode.